Hi, I'm Liz, and this is the Malecón.
It's where people go on dates and hang out. It's also a place where we say goodbye. I've met up with many friends here over the years before they left Cuba. Some went to the United States.
A veces no lo parece, pero Yuma está ahí mismo, 90 miles away.
The US is seen by many as a land of hope and opportunity. But the United States is also the cause of many of our problems. It's a contradiction that's easy to forget about here in our day-to-day struggle to get by. And because there doesn't seem to be any way things can get better. Earlier this year, frustrations boiled over into anti-government protests. They only lasted a matter of hours, but they were a big deal because nothing like it had happened for more than 60 years. Since then, people in Cuba and around the world are talking more than ever about our future. I want to be part of that conversation, pero antes debemos entender cómo llegamos a las protestas.
To do that, we need to look both inside Cuba y hacia el norte.
The July 11 protests didn't start in Havana. They began here in downtown San Antonio de los Baños, a small city not far from Cuba's capital. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel came here a few hours later.
Nosotros vinimos aquí para, junto a los revolucionarios de este pueblo, demostrar que aquí la calle es de los revolucionarios.
But the anti-government protests had already broken out in cities across the country. San Antonio has been calm since July 11. So why did people take the streets here?
El 11 de julio, ¿cuál es el motivo de las protestas?
Habían varios motivos. El tema de la corriente fue uno. Quizás en algún punto era el pico de la pandemia también. Se juntaron varias situaciones.
Hola.
Los apagones eran 4 horas, 5 horas. Por eso fue la revuelta que hubo aquí en San Antonio de los Baños. La situación aquí en Cuba ha sido mala. La medicina entra pocas veces a la farmacia. La dipirona no ha entrado. Hace como 3 meses que no entra.
El apagón fue el top, ya el pueblo estaba tan a tope entre COVID y medicinas que no tenía. El pueblo, mientras no le afecte mucho el tema medicina y más o menos tenga su plato de comida, no va a protestar.
20 pesos, un pequeño plátano burro, ¿qué más quiere que te diga?
¿Qué es lo más difícil?
Las medicinas y el alimento, las dos cosas más importantes.
¿Por qué usted cree que la gente se lanza a la calle?
Aquí en la divisa. Yo por lo menos no puedo acceder ahí. Yo no gano mal en mi trabajo porque trabajo en el campo, pero no puedo comprar nada. El bloqueo es que nos tiene a nosotros contra la pared.
The Cuban government blames the economic crisis on US sanctions, and many Cubans agree.
Hola, buenos días.
El bloqueo afecta al pueblo completo. Lo que Trump hizo a Cuba, 100 y pico de medidas para jodernos a nosotros. Y ahora es baile, tan sinvergüenza como el otro.
But others, especially young people, blame the Cuban government.
Va a la tienda moneda nacional y no hay nada. ¿Que es donde nosotros podemos comprar? Porque hay tantas tiendas en verde. Dice aquí nadie le paga en verde.
El 11 de julio estaba parado en la esquina ahí.
¿Qué pensaste en ese momento?
Que la gente se cansaron de los apagones, de la comida, que sales a buscar algo por la calle y no lo encuentras.
¿Quién cree la gente que es responsable?
Los dirigentes.
No todo el mundo va a hablar, no todo el mundo va a decir.
Lo sé.
Todavía hay gente preso del 11 de julio que no han salido. Entonces, imagínate.
¿Qué es lo que dirías que es más difícil aquí?
La comida y la medicina.
¿Quién es el responsable de todas las escaseces?
Los arriba, ¿no? Deben ese leo, ¿no? El gobierno.
¿Cómo te mantienes informado?
Oh, Facebook se ve todo el mundo sube todo. Mira, se fue la luz ahora mismo, mira. Viste, ya por allá están gritando, se fue la luz. Se fue la luz.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? Fíjate eso, con nosotros no hay quien pueda.
Te
In Cuba, people have different opinions about who is to blame for our economic crisis. In Washington, one view predominates.
There is only one blockade in Cuba, and it is the blockade that this regime has imposed on its people.
The regime still sanctions, or I should say, keeps people on, long lines to get basic foods as a way of controlling the people.
Cuba is unfortunately, a failed state.
Si el fracaso económico es solo debido al gobierno cubano, ¿qué sentido tiene el bloqueo? In April 1960, a State Department memo proposed that the United States should deny money and supplies to Cuba to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. In 1962, John F. Kennedy followed that advice, imposing a full trade embargo on Cuba. 60 years later, the embargo is still in place, and it's even more far-reaching. In Cuba, we call it the blockade. The blockade isn't just between Cuba and the United States, it's global. In 1992, the Torricelli Act blocked any ship that docks in Cuba from entering a U.S. port for 6 months, and it banned foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba. Democratic Senator Robert Torricelli said the act was meant to wreak havoc on the island. 4 years later, Bill Clinton signed a law designed to stop foreign investment in Cuba called the Helms-Burton Act. Under Barack Obama, the US government began fining European banks billions of dollars for processing transactions involving Cuba and other countries. Donald Trump imposed an avalanche of sanctions, further isolating Cuba from the US and the rest of the world. If this wasn't enough, just before leaving office, Trump put Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list.
They're not Trump's regulations anymore, they're Joe Biden's.
Cuba is suffering stronger sanctions now than I think any other country, although it is of course no threat at all to the US.
Why don't companies and banks outside the US want to do business with Cuba?
The sanctions on Cuba, they act extraterritorially. The European banks that won't touch a transaction, even if legal. I've counseled these banks that they're afraid of being fined and punished by the United States. How interested would you be in a €100 fee for transmitting funds involving Cuba if somehow it violates U.S. sanctions and they come after you for millions and millions of dollars? The U.S. Treasury has reaped from European banks close to $12–15 billion. The risk is too great, the reward's too small.
What's been the impact of the US government putting Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list?
The banks and the companies that they were dealing with before would back off because they were advised by their compliance departments not to deal with Cuba. The compliance departments have been growing in the last few years because of anti-money laundering provisions, which have been getting stronger. And it was clearly a political decision to put Cuba on that list. And the effects have been devastating. COVID, combined with US sanctions, has been to create a crisis in the Cuban economy. Suddenly, you've got half as much foreign exchange coming into the country. Now, if you look at what the foreign exchange is used by, 50% is spent on food and fuel. The trouble is with Cuba is access to international finance was curtailed, severely curtailed, during the same period. So the cushion that every other country in the world has in terms of borrowing money during crisis was not available to Cuba. It was completely unavoidable that there would be insecurity on food, that there would be power cuts, and that the medical services would be stretched. There was absolutely no miracle that could have been achieved that would have prevented those things from happening.
When Cuba was put back on the list, all banks stopped handling any transactions involving Cuba. Cuba is not a supporter of international terrorism. Nobody seriously would argue they are. Cuba's on the terrorist list now, not because of Donald Trump. It's on the terrorist list because Joe Biden hasn't taken them off the list.
Cuba doesn't publish its own list of terrorists supporting governments. If it did, the US government would be on it. In 1976, a bomb attack against a Cuban civilian airliner killed 73 people. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere until 9/11. The suspected masterminds were former CIA operatives Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch Avila. Both later lived freely in Miami and were never prosecuted for the crime by US authorities. An Italian tourist was killed by a bomb in a hotel in Havana in 1997. And recently, Cuban state media reported an escalation of violent attacks financed by Cuban Americans since Trump assumed office. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo claimed the Cuban government supports murderers, bomb makers, and hijackers. But Pompeo may not be the most credible source.
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
Healthcare in Cuba is free, and every community has a health clinic with a doctor and a nurse.
Muchas gracias, doctor.
Roxana is the doctor to more than 400 families in Center Havana's Cayo Hueso neighborhood.
Un médico de familia es un médico que está directamente vinculado a la comunidad, que forme parte de la familia de cada uno de los pacientes que nosotros tenemos.
¿Cómo ha sido tu trabajo en los últimos años?
Desde que comenzó la COVID hasta la fecha ha sido mucho más intenso.
Of Roxana's 1,000 patients, 39 have gotten COVID. None have died. Her biggest challenge these days isn't COVID, but shortages of medications for other health conditions.
Lo que te voy a dar es loratadina, que es lo que sacan, porque benadrilina no sacan. ¿Desde cuándo no tienes tratamiento para la presión?
Hace 15 días.
Hay que reajustarle el tratamiento porque Cartopril hace 2 meses que no entra. Dipirona no hay Mercedes. En estos momentos hay escasez de todos los medicamentos. Es difícil manejarlo porque supuestamente nosotros debemos dar una solución. Por mucho que queramos, a veces no podemos.
¿Cómo es posible que Cuba tenga una industria biofarmacéutica capaz de producir vacunas para enfrentar la COVID-19 y al mismo tiempo tenga este déficit tan grande de medicamentos?
Fidel tuvo la previsión aquella y desarrolló la biotecnología, pero la materia prima viene de otros países. Países que si Estados Unidos, por el embargo, les prohíbe darnos la materia prima, ya no se pueden hacer aquí.
During the last year, the Cuban health system has had to practice triage. Many of its resources have gone to fighting COVID at the expense of producing basic medications.
Surte la farmacia los medicamentos cada 15 días. A veces no pasa.
Esta sería la parte de las cremas, que cremas sí no tenemos ninguna. ¿Qué es lo que más es reciente que falta? Aquí los antibióticos, los antiinflamatorios, la duralgina, los antihistamínicos. Es difícil. Estamos detrás del mostrador, ver una madre que llega desesperada con un bebé, uno trata de darle la solución, pero nosotros tenemos familia y a veces nos vemos en ese problema.
Every afternoon, Roxana makes house calls.
Gracias. Esa no puedes tener el pie así, tienes que ponerlo en alto, esto es circulatorio. Martín recién debutó con una diabetes, ya tiene su tratamiento, se está controlando. Yamila, buenos días. ¿Cómo te estás? Más o menos, yo te veo lo más bien. Te estoy viendo hasta en Facebook y todo. Te descubrí, ¿viste? ¿Viste que yo estoy en todas?
¿Ha tenido usted muchos déficits con los medicamentos últimamente?
Ella le mandaron un medicamento. Sí. Para probarte los sodios, se le empezó a mandar. Pero desapareció el medicamento.
¿Y duragina tienes aunque sea, Yamila?
No. Cuando ella está con dolor de cabeza, simplemente le pongo pañitos fríos en la cabeza.
Roxana has seen tough times. She became a doctor during Cuba's special period, the economic depression after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yo me gradué en el año 93. Hasta la fecha, primera vez en todos esos años que yo he visto una situación como esta en estos momentos.
We have to vote for a new Cuba policy as well. This administration approach isn't working.
Here in Cuba, we expected a change in U.S. policy when Biden was elected, and we weren't the only ones.
Our expectations were that he would quickly do away with many of the policies that seemed extremely politically driven.
Instead of implementing a new Cuba policy, the Biden administration did a policy review first. Was that necessary?
From the outside, it looks like what it was mostly a delaying tactic that would serve what they construed as being their political interests in Florida. Often, a crisis gives you a chance to change policy. And Cuba has been experiencing a deep economic crisis driven primarily by COVID, the loss of tourism, and the Trump measures. It would have been so easy on humanitarian grounds to argue, this is a crisis, let's help the Cuban people. And this administration completely missed the opportunity. So there were some things that would have been very easy: to restore remittances, one memorandum; to reverse the Trump policy of putting Cuba on the terrorist list, one memorandum; to reopen the embassy, but they didn't do it. And they've escalated what they call democracy promotion programs, which are really regime change programs to put pressure on the government. What we see here is a distancing from Barack Obama, even though Joe Biden was vice president at the time. It's almost as if they were trying to be more Trump than Trump on the Cuba issue.
So why is Biden trying to be more Trump than Trump?
They thought that buying time was going to get them political credibility in the Miami community, which I think it's foolish. It's doomed to fail. But if you go and you're trying to chase after the old right-wing leadership of the Miami community, and which the Republicans already own, you're not going to get anywhere. The Biden administration, they are now stuck in a trap. The 11 July protests in Cuba, which have been spun almost universally here in the United States as evidence of increasing prospects of regime collapse in Havana, have further strengthened those who've argued that now is not the time to do a new policy.
This year, the economic situation got so bad, you could feel the anger and tension in the street.
Cuba was a tinderbox. It would only take a spark to start a fire.
Throughout 2020, Cuba had one of the world's lowest COVID rates. Mass graves were built across the Americas, but Cuba had only 146 deaths by the end of the year. Cases were so low in Cuba, we sent thousands of doctors to dozens of countries. But in early 2021, our COVID rate started increasing. Then, in June, as the Delta variant hit Cuba, cases suddenly skyrocketed. The first epicenter of this outbreak was Matanzas province, east of Havana. Hospitals were overflowing, and the death rate soared. As the pandemic overtook Matanzas, the hashtags SOS Matanzas and SOS Cuba went viral on Twitter. The tweets were about Cuba, but they caught fire outside the island. Not all the concern was genuine. Fake accounts and bots were pumping out thousands of tweets a day. Suddenly, celebrities jumped on the bandwagon. Some blamed the Cuban government. Most just tweeted SOS Cuba. But what did SOS Cuba mean? In Miami, it meant more than just helping people on the island.
Necesitamos una intervención humanitaria ya para el pueblo de Cuba.
Una intervención humanitaria.
Humanitarian interventions are basically military interventions, supposedly to stop human rights abuses, but often used to justify war. All this had nothing to do with Cuba's COVID crisis. It's a double standard. There were no SOS hashtags for Brazil, India, Italy, and nobody called for a humanitarian intervention of the United States, even though it has had 3 times more COVID deaths per capita than Cuba. After SOS Cuba blew up around the world, it caught fire inside Cuba, at first online, and then on the streets.
In Cuba, we have a joke. Nuestro deporte nacional no es la pelota, sino la lucha.
We've lived under the US blockade for as long as I've been alive, and a lot longer than that. We have struggled and have found ways to survive, but this past year, they pushed us to the brink.
Para luego pretender que nos estaban ayudando.